Hello, everybody. Welcome into the Two for Talking podcast. I'm your host, Corey Tusick. I've got Josh Yohe with The Athletic alongside, and then I've got comedian Joe Bartnick, where you can check him out at Sadman's in Boca Raton on August 8th and August 9th, and then up in Boston at the Boston Comedy Studio on August 23rd. And we have a very special guest. That would be none other than the Paul Steigerwald. Staggy, welcome to the show.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here, man. I'm excited. I've watched your show many times and never thought I'd really make it.
Oh, you have an open invitation, Staggy. And by the way, early happy birthday to Stag, who has a birthday coming up in a few days. So,
happy birthday, Stags. Yeah, the invitation is always open. You know that.
I will be on August the 6th. I'll be Evgeny Malkin, believe it or not.
Looking good, Stag.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I thought you meant on the trading block.
That too, baby.
Well, Staggy, everybody kind of knows, you've been with the Penguins forever, but I really wanted to know, where did your love for hockey start and like your relationship with the Penguins as a team? Because I'm sure, you were there whenever they started and everything before you were a team employee. Were you just always a hockey fan?
Well, I was lucky enough to live in a neighborhood with a lot of kids. We played every sport. We talked about sports. And I remember in ninth grade, we used to have to walk from my house up through the neighborhood to the top of the hill to catch the bus to South Hills Catholic High School. So I was a freshman in high school, and my buddies were into sports. And one of them had found a magazine about hockey in a thrift drugstore. And we were walking up and we were looking through the pages of it, and we were looking at the Penguins goalies and stuff, and we were talking about hockey. And then we kind of took an interest in the Penguins a little bit. And then it turned out that the daughter of Jack Riley, the original general manager of the Penguins, lived the street below us and went to the same school. And one of my buddy's younger brothers knew her because he was in her class, and he said he could get tickets for games. Well, eventually I became the weasel that called Jack Riley's house every night to get tickets. And I would call, and Mrs. Riley would answer, and I'd say, "Hi, Mrs. Riley, it's Paul Steigerwald. Can I get some tickets?" By the time I got like halfway through the sentence, she would go, "Yeah, Paul, come on down." Like, it's like I didn't even have to ask anymore. I just had to identify myself. And then my dad and my buddies and I would pile into the car where he would drive, and we would go down to the Riley residence, go to the door. She'd come out with these yellow coupons for tickets. And then we'd take them down to the Civic Arena and go to the will call window and redeem them. And I went to 35 games in 69-70 and saw Michel Briere play most of his home games that year. And really just became totally in love with the game. And I always wanted to get into broadcasting right from the time I was like in 8th grade. So when I first started to hear hockey announcers, I thought that was really cool. And then we started to play tabletop games, and I would call the tabletop games against my buddies, and it just grew from there. And to be able to go, and then eventually, I think our sophomore year in high school, we all decided to play hockey. So we joined the South Park League, and I was a goalie. So that's how my love of the game really started. I probably took to it more because I did have kind of an affinity for the hockey announcing part, and really liked it, and decided pretty much when I was in high school that that's what I wanted to do.
Staggy, you joined the Penguins, I think 1980. Is that what you think? When we think of the Penguins, we think of the Mario era, and I think when we think of the Sid era, for the majority of fans, right?
Yeah.
But you go back before then, and you've told me some stories. Can you tell people what the organization was like when you started? Because it really sounded to me like it was the wild, wild west. Like you almost couldn't believe it. Like truth is stranger than fiction, right?
Well, it was pretty lean. Let's put it that way. I mean, when I started with the Penguins, first of all, the reason I got a job with the Penguins was because I had worked in radio. I was sold radio time in the late 70s for WDVE and KQV radio. And I called a guy named Don LaRose, who was Canadian, and he had worked with Nelson Scalbania, who originally signed Wayne Gretzky in Indianapolis, and he was talking about the kid all the time. He loved Gretzky, and this was like when I first got there in 1980. But anyway, I called Don LaRose because I didn't really like selling time anymore, and I was kind of out of work, and I was doing some stringing for UPI radio for the Pirate games, and I went to a Penguin game with a tape recorder and I taped myself. So I had a demo tape from a game between the Penguins and the Red Wings, and I called this guy Don LaRose. I said, "Hey, I want to get into broadcasting." I said, "You got any tips for me, like in the minor leagues, where I could call and stuff like that?" So he gave me some names, but he asked me about myself. He said, "Well, what do you do?" And what do you? So I told him about selling time and how some of my clients were like Pepsi, and there was a lady named Betty Robson who worked for BBDO, a big ad agency. So he kind of did a little research on me, and because there weren't that many people around who loved hockey, who also knew how to sell radio time and the things that I liked to do. So I eventually did get a job with the Johnstown Red Wings right up the road. So I did that first year of hockey broadcasting in the minors in the Eastern Hockey League up in Johnstown. And we got to March, and all of a sudden I get a phone call from Don LaRose, and he's offering me a job with the Penguins. And so I came in and talked to him and Paul Martha and Vince Bartimo, who was a scary guy. He was like a gangster, for the DeBartolo Corporation. Those guys hired me, and it was pretty cool. And I was working in marketing, and Don LaRose, within a month of me leaving or getting there, he left to become the GM of the Meadows. So he basically said, "Here, I'm going to teach you how to do this job." He got a legal pad out, and we went through every facet of being the marketing director of the Penguins. I was 26 years old, and it was in this, early in the spring. It was like in March, April. So, the real work was done in the summertime to prepare for the following season. So I just followed the track that he gave me, but we had very few people in the organization. Terry Schiffauer was the PR guy. There was a group sales guy. There were a couple of secretaries. There was a ticket office, and, I was pretty much a one-man band. I mean, I had to do Goal Magazine, the program. I had to, sell the sponsorships to people like Dollar Bank and Pepsi and Open Pantry. And those were our big sponsors. So I did all that work. And then they knew I wanted to be in broadcasting. So I got the opportunity to do some between periods work on the simulcast. Mike Lange was on the radio and also on TV. It was a simulcast back then. So I would do the radio side in between periods. And go to the radio station and call people and record interviews and all that kind of thing. And then for home games, I would tape interviews and we would play them during the intermission. So that's how my career started. But, it was an interesting time. Paul Martha was also very involved with the San Francisco 49ers. He would fly every Sunday to San Francisco to watch the 49ers play. Then he'd come back to Pittsburgh on the red eye from California, show up in the office on Monday morning, like haggard, wearing his pinstripe suit. And, he was the president of the team. And it was just, it was fun times. I mean, everybody just had a good time. It was just a different world back then. And it wasn't anything, unseemly. It was just that it was just a different world. I mean, the way it was hockey, you know what I mean? The girls had potty mouths just like the guys did, and you just knew that if you were in hockey, you couldn't have a thin skin. You couldn't be offended by cursing or foul language, because that was just the way the world was back then in 1980. I thought it was kind of cool, and I adjusted to it. And I remember Mike Lange and Terry Schiffauer. After games, they would always go into Schiff's office, and Mikey would bring his briefcase down. He'd open it up, and there'd be a couple of Miller Lights in there, and he'd pull them out. And Schiff would have to send stats back to the league. They had like a teletype thing, kind of weird machine, and he would send back the game summary to the National Hockey League office on this machine. So we'd be in there talking about hockey, and the Penguins were pretty good the first year I was there, but when things got bad around 82, 83, there was a lot of bitterness and kind of negativity and sarcasm and all the things that go along with losing, right? And you never knew what was going to happen next, because you knew that the business was shaky, and so that's what, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here, but just to give you an idea of what it was like in the 80s, that's kind of the way it felt. Like there was impending doom all the time. We didn't know what was going to happen next, because the team was not playing well and we were losing and the business was not doing well.
Isn't that what it's all about, though, Stag? Like, I remember, I always say, when they wore powder blue, unironically.
Yeah. Well, the color was kind of, listen, I'll never forget in the 70s. I think I was in Johnstown. I think I came home and watched a game, and Bob Prince was calling it. And he had Brian Spinner Spencer on the ice for an interview. And Spinner Spencer standing there with that floppy hair. And he says, I just don't like being associated with a bird that can't fly. And I think he was traded like the next day. So he was no longer associated with a bird that can't fly. But that was Spinner Spencer. And you know his story. I mean, his dad actually broke into a TV studio one night and was upset because they weren't showing his son's game, like with a gun or something, like really crazy stuff. You ever read the story about Brian Spinner Spencer? He used to jump off the training table and land on his feet like this with his toes curled under. So he would jump down and land like that on his toes. And, John Doolin, our equipment manager, man, that would be a good guy to get on the air sometime because he could tell you some unbelievable stories about some of these players. But, there were some just different characters. And, the gunner was one of them, by the way. And by the way, while I'm on the subject of the gunner, Mike Lange traveled with him to Cleveland once to do a game against the Cleveland Crusaders, who are the World Hockey Association. They took a bus and the gunner he reached into his briefcase and he pulled out a steak that he had the night before at a restaurant. What he would do is he would take the steak and he would put it in tinfoil and he'd dump an unbelievable amount of salt on it. And then he would close it back up. So he gets this steak out in front of Mikey on the bus on the way to Cleveland. And then he has a big thing of one of those big milk bottles. He's expecting there to be screwdrivers in it. Orange juice and vodka. And there was milk in there. And he's there, God damn, Betty, she did it again. He was mad because she switched it out on him. And they saw a balloon. They saw a balloon going over on the way to a game. And the gunner said, that's the noon balloon to Saskatoon. No, Terry Schiffauer said it. He said, that's the noon balloon to Saskatoon. And the gunner used that phrase all the time on baseball games. That's how the noon balloon to Saskatoon ended up on Pirate games. Terry Schiffauer said it to the gunner on a bus ride. But could you imagine what it was like to have the gunner riding on the bus with you, to do hockey? I mean, seriously, and Mikey Lange really got a lot from that. Like he saw how the gunner operated, and I think a lot of that rubbed off on him.
I saw a clip within the last year. For younger fans, they might not know, is that Dave Schultz at the end of his career was a Penguin for a year.
Oh yeah.
And I saw it. I remember I was a wee little kid, but I saw a clip of the gunner interviewing Schultz on the ice, and people were heckling him. And Prince is like, "You don't want him going up there, people, don't you?" You remember that?
I didn't see that interview, but it's funny you said, because that's what they did. To do interviews after the game, they just trained the camera from the camera you would use to cover the game down to the ice, and the gunner would stand down there with some. That's what he did with Spinner Spencer. I mean, that's a unique way to do an interview, but Bob Prince didn't care. He went down there and did the interview. But you know who else ended his career with the Penguins, or played very late in his career with the Penguins, was Derek Sanderson. A lot of people don't remember that, but I was at Kent State, and my partner was Rick Peckham, who later, he's inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame, the longtime voice of the Tampa Bay Lightning, and before that, the Hartford Whalers. And Rick Peckham and I came to a game, and Terry Schiffauer gave us credentials. It was at the end of our college careers, and we went down and interviewed players after the game. I interviewed Pierre LaRouche. It's somewhere in a box. I still have that interview. It was part of a demo tape that I put together. And on the Rick Peckham was really excited to interview Derek Sanderson because that was his favorite player, like growing up. And so he interviewed him. His nickname was Turk. And so the Rick Peckham, we called him Turk because he loved Derek Sanderson. But I'll never forget that night. I remember interviewing Pierre LaRouche. He couldn't have been nicer to me. And I asked him about the playoffs, and he said, it doesn't matter who we play. You got to go through all the teams anyway to win the cup and stuff like that. It was pretty cool to have that opportunity. But that was my first time in an NHL locker room. I was at Kent State and with Rick Peckham, who, it's pretty cool. I worked with Rick Peckham at Kent State and Mike Fornes. All three of us were able to broadcast games in the NHL.
Wow, that's wild. That's wild.
Do you remember 75, 83? See, my personal Vietnam was 93. I can't, as much as I love the Penguins, I don't even love them as much as I did before Volek. I can't get hurt that bad. But what remember? I remember my grandfather being upset 75, and then I remember more 83, 82, 83. What do you remember about those times?
Well, what I remember mostly is that, I was really into hockey like in 69, 70, and right up until about 72 when I left to go to college. Right. So then I became like interested in things you're interested in college. But we had a club team. It was the Kent State Clippers. They were a club team, and they were started actually by Steve Albert, the younger brother of Marv Albert. And he started this club team, and they actually were pretty cool. We played Ohio U, and we played Brock State, and all these other colleges that had club teams. And so I got kind of misdirected. And then I started to get into the Cleveland Crusaders because I'd go up and watch their games. So I was more kind of had an affinity for the World Hockey Association at that point. I wasn't really following the NHL that much. And then I remember my buddy, Keith Gibson, who grew up down the street from me. We were best friends. We were roommates at Kent State. He was talking about this guy calling games for the Penguins. Have you heard that guy, Mike Lange? He's really good. I really like the way he calls games. And so I just remember, being somewhat interested in the Penguins that way. And then when the Penguins had that really good team in 74, 75 with all those 20-goal scorers, I think there was 9 of them. I became interested. But I was in college. I wasn't here in Pittsburgh. And, you didn't have the access to the games on TV like you do today. So it was, if you weren't, the only way I could listen to it was like a pick up KDK radio from Kent, Ohio. But I do remember coming home and hanging out at my buddy's apartment up on Squirrel Hill, and the game was on the radio, the 1-0 loss in Game 7 when Eddie Westfall scored to ruin the season. The Penguins had a 3-0 lead in that series. I happened to hear that on the radio at my buddy's apartment. I really wasn't paying all that close attention to it. So it didn't hit me as hard as it might have because I wasn't, really immersed at that point. But I knew it wasn't good that they lost that way. And also then I heard, tales of the bankruptcy. And I just kind of felt almost like, I don't know if I want to have anything to do with the Penguins. It's all these tragedies all the time. I'd like to get into hockey, but I really don't know if I want to go to Pittsburgh. And then, of course, Mike Lange was there. I wanted to be a broadcaster, and I thought, is this a good idea to go there? Because I'm never going to be able to, move ahead of him. He's I could tell he was a legend right from the start. But I was lucky enough to work with him, so it was kind of. I never really aspired to be a color analyst, but I kind of got thrown into it because Terry Schiffauer decided he didn't want to do it anymore. And so they said, you do it, and that's how it was in those days. That would never happen today. But I took that gig, and, I did about 15 games on TV until they decided to do all the games on television because of cable. And they decided to make them all simulcasts and home and away. So I got to travel with the team. I think the first time I traveled was in 85, 86. And from that point on, I called every game up until, up until they kicked me off the air in 2017.
Isn't that something though, Stag? Like you know as much as anybody, and you're a part of it, no doubt. That taking nothing away from 71 and 68, that Mike Lange is number 3 probably on the all-time human beings for the Pittsburgh Penguins, because for years, it's the Steelers and the Penguins. They got that announcer is great. We love that announcer,
No question. And I think a lot of it was because he was kind of like another Bob Prince and Myron Cope. He was in that realm. It was something that only in Pittsburgh, I think that we kind of have. We're really lucky that way. I don't know, something in the water, but Mike Lange picked up on the fact that he could be a folk hero, which is what he really was. And by just going out in the community and touching the people, up close. And he was so creative, and he had an incredible voice, and he brought the game to life in a way that nobody else could. And I think the fact that games weren't on TV was actually a benefit, to him, because he was your connection to the game, and he made it seem so cool because of the way he described the game on the radio. But, if he had just done TV, from day one, TV's not the same. That's the beauty of radio. That's what hooked me on wanting to be a hockey announcer, was listening to Dan Kelly on KMOX, or, Lloyd Pettit calling Chicago Blackhawks games, and Al Shaver up in Minnesota. Those are the guys that I grew up listening to. And they just captivated me. You know what I mean? And I think Mike Lange did the same thing for a whole couple of generations of Pittsburghers who really got hooked on the game because he colorized it in a way that very few people could do it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, he absolutely, legend. And I mean, you could hear it probably, like you said, right whenever you first heard him. Staggy, I want to know, we all know the big guy, he comes along and saves everything. But where were you when you first heard the name Mario Lemieux?
I was working as a marketing director of the Penguins, and, where our team was horrible. It was 83-84. It was a disaster. Lou Angotti was our coach. He was a nice man. I got to know him a little bit. He would stop into my office and vent sometimes, about things. And but then, late in that season, I started hearing about this kid in Quebec. And then, Tom McMillan went up. He was covering the Penguins for the Post-Gazette at that time. He went up to Quebec and interviewed him. Ken Meese, who was a sportscaster for KDK TV. The KDK TV was smart enough to know that this was a good idea to go up and get a story on this guy. That's one of the reasons why KDK was always associated with hockey in Pittsburgh, because they were smart. They knew when to jump on the bandwagon, and they knew that Mario Lemieux was a story. So Ken Meese went up there and interviewed him. So now I'm the marketing director, and I'm thinking, man, we got to get this guy. And, we're just hoping that we're going to lose, so we get him. And, so I, as the marketing director, I was really excited about finally having a player that we could really get excited about, somebody who we thought, could lead us to the promised land. I mean, Eddie Johnston was there. He'd had that experience with Bobby Orr. So he was telling us, we get this guy just like Orr. He wasn't wrong. I mean, everything he said about Mario was totally true. And so then it was just a matter of, how am I going to exploit this? How am I going to capitalize on this? And so I came up with a few creative, brochures that we did when we finally did draft him. And, we had a brochure that said Class of 84. It was a picture of Mario, Doug Bodger, and Roger Belanger posing, all three of them in Penguin uniforms after they had been drafted in the first round in Montreal. But I'll never forget that day when he didn't come to the table. And, so it was just a really exciting time. But, when I first heard his name, it was just like everybody else did. But the difference is I had a reason to really, really want to learn everything I could about how good he was going to be. And we did a brochure, by the way, guys, and I wanted to have quotes from key people who had seen him play and put that in the brochure. If you find the old brochure that we put out, Scotty Bowman's quoted, Glenn Sather is quoted, I think Wayne Gretzky is quoted. So we did everything we could to kind of make sure that we let people know this guy is special. He's going to be awesome, and you ought to be coming to games. And that's how we sold tickets, before he ever stepped on the ice.
Staggy, I know you've always had a great relationship with Mario, and you met him at the very beginning. If I'm not mistaken, you had to go to the airport to pick him up. Could you tell everyone that story? And could you maybe just talk a little bit about your relationship with him, especially in the early years when, like you said, the Penguins were a bare bones organization. There weren't that many people around. And I think you're one of the guys that really made him feel comfortable when he came to Pittsburgh.
Well, fortunately, because I was the marketing director, and, I had a kind of a different approach than most, because I was also a broadcaster. So I would interview players for the radio, and that gave me a chance to be around the locker room. And normally in the hockey world, and it's still this way today, not quite nearly as much as it was, but back in those days, there was a division between the business side and the hockey side. You didn't fraternize with players. People who worked upstairs in the office didn't go downstairs to the locker room. Players, with very exception of a very few, would ever migrate to upstairs and come up to the office. There was that separation. But because I had done broadcasting and interviewed players and also been in the business side, I was the perfect guy to kind of take over that whole idea of trying to promote Mario. So Paul Martha was smart. He came to my door the day that Mario came to Pittsburgh first time, and he just knocked he went, "Hey, can you go pick up Mario at the airport? There'll be a car waiting out here at about 5 o'clock. I said, "Nah, I don't want to go. You get somebody else to do it." No, I said, "Yeah." "Oh, yeah, I want to go." So I got in the car and rode out there. It was a black, town car type. It wasn't like a limo. And we waited in the front of the old airport, and I was sitting in the front seat. And I look up, and here comes Big Mario with his dad, Jean-Guy, and Bob Perno, his agent. 3 of them walking towards the car. They get in, and I'm pretty darn sure Mario sat in the middle of those 2 guys. And I'll never forget, I sat in the front, and I kind of turned around to address them in the back seat. And as we were approaching the tunnel, I said to Mario, "Wait till you see this, what Pittsburgh looks like when we come out of the tunnel. Get ready." He goes, nods his head, So then we go through, and then his eyes light up. Like, he gave me he didn't have to say much. Mario is, he's a man of few words. It's, he gives you the nod. That's all you need. So he was excited to see the city for the first time. And my brother John, I'd given him a tip. He was working for Channel 4 at the time. I told him I was going to pick him up and bring him to the Hyatt. So my brother was waiting in the lobby of the Hyatt. So he got to do the first interview with Mario for Channel 4. So that was pretty cool. And, then it was just a matter of, because I had met Mario that quickly, and Bob Perno, his agent, who kind of watched over him a little bit, I was able to then go to Mario and say, "Can you do this? Can you do that?" And then before he ever played a game, we did a couple of promotions and signings and things like that, just to kind of drum up some interest. And then for the first couple of years, he would do a couple of appearances. He did something out at the mall in Route 51 out there, the Bartolo Mall. What was it called again? I forget right now. But so that was pretty cool, just being able to hang out with him. And what was cool was that he was sitting in the back of the bus, always in the back, and he would say really funny things, but he wouldn't say them. He would say them really quietly, and then Bob Airy would say it. So you thought that it was Bob Airy coming up with it, but it was actually Mario. But Bobby was like his, puppet. He would say it for him. So Mario didn't have to be the one saying it. But Bobby would, bark out stuff from the back of the bus. You know what I mean? It was fun times.
It's funny you say that, Stag. We mentioned Marv Albert's name earlier. Mario does an unbelievable Marv Albert impersonation.
Well, he got that from me. Yeah, he got that from me.
This is probably 10 years ago. I'm walking down the hallway with Staggy at the arena. Staggy looks at Mario and says, "Give me the Marv Albert." And he goes, "Jordan for 3. It was unbelievably good.
Well, I used to go, I used to do the old, "Tonight in the NHL, brought to you by Sony Corporation of America. It's the Sony, and by National Car Rental, the big green team, 10,000 people working for you." And I would do that for Mario, and he'd laugh, and so then he learned Jordan so he called me one time and left a voicemail. He said, Jordan for 3. Yes. Then he goes, "Scottie Pippen from the Key." And I lost it. I lost the voicemail. I should have never erased that. It should still be on my phone, but it was a classic.
This is just fabulous stuff. Corey has to make sure we are recording, correct? Because I did not hear it say, okay.
Yeah.
And then this is all brought to us by the great Bill Neofus. We should throw him in before it's too late.
Mr. Bill Neofus, the great insurance agent, the greatest of all of them.
Who's a huge Staggy fan. He's not just the best insurance man in Pittsburgh. That's neofusinsurance.com, by the way. He's also a particularly big Paul Steigerwald fan. Sometimes we'll be having lunch. I'll say, "You got any good Staggy stories?" I'm like, "Staggy?" I said, "We got to bring Staggy to lunch so he can tell you the stories himself." But nobody has better Pittsburgh Penguin stories than Paul Steigerwald.
I'm always a little careful. I mean, I'm not being as careful right now, even tonight, as I probably should be. But anyway, it's fun to reminisce about things. I think the statute of limitations is up on some things, but one of the things that happens is when you work for the same organization for 45 years, a lot of this stuff to me is like yesterday, and it doesn't feel old and sort of so distant in the past that I can just talk about anything. To me, it's still fresh, and I feel like I'm just as careful about compromising other people or myself in any way as I would have been as it was happening 30 years ago, just because I'm still there.
Oh yeah, Stags, we're kind of going the timeline of the Penguins. You are like the living history of the Penguins. What was a key moment to me? Almost, because let's face it, even with Mario, we were kind of people don't understand. We were like the Clippers, many ways. But I remember the day we traded for Paul Coffey, and that just seemed like it was like a new. As much as Mario was a new beginning, this just seemed like everything changed then for real. Can you tell me what you thought that day? I just remember everyone was just like, "Oh my God, we got Paul Coffey."
Couldn't agree more. I think the reason that was the case was because, we didn't have a winner. We didn't have anybody who'd ever won anything. Coffey was also always associated with the Oilers and with Wayne Gretzky being his other winger, if you will. And Phil Esposito had Bobby Orr, and Gretzky had Paul Coffey. Well, now Mario had Paul Coffey, and it legitimized the Penguins. It made us feel all of a sudden like we were real, like we were actually in the club, or we might be able to start doing some big things. And I give Eddie Johnston a lot of credit for pulling that off. There had been rumors that the Penguins were in the market for Paul Coffey because he was having a contract dispute with the Oilers, and a lot of people thought that the Penguins were one team that could make a deal with Edmonton because we had drafted a couple of pretty good hockey players along the way, all because of Eddie Johnston's philosophy. I mean, he basically said we can't keep trading away our picks, and so for several years in a row we had some pretty good picks, including Chris Joseph, who was traded to the Oilers for Paul Coffey. He never really blossomed into the player we thought he would, but he was good enough as a prospect that the Oilers were excited to get him. And when we got Paul Coffey, he was so cool too. He's like a really good looking dude. He was so much fun to watch. It was ridiculous. I'll never forget the first game. We took the puck behind the net. He told Steve Gannett to get the fuck out of the way. And he grabbed the puck and just took off the length of the ice against the Quebec Nordiques. It was like breathtaking. It was like, oh my God, kind of like the way Connor McDavid is now. Yeah. Like he just took off. And from that moment on, we were so excited to have him there. And man, the Penguins were fun to watch. I mean, he wore 77. You had Robbie Brown, 44, they called it double trouble. And, Mario 66. And it was really, really fun to watch those guys play. Their power play was incredible. And it was just all offense all the time. But Coffey had Randy Hillier as his partner, who kind of watched the back door for him, and Bob Airy too. Bob Airy played left wing, and he had to kind of watch the back door because Coffey was always moving up, and Airy was like a hinge, like Coffey would move up, Airy would come back, and I love that about the way they strategized that. In fact, I thought the Penguins should have done that this year with Erik Karlsson. They should have had a guy who kind of became his other half, who would make sure that he was watching the back door if Karlsson took off. I don't think Erik Karlsson activates enough with the puck. I think he tries to pass the puck through people instead of carrying it more into the offensive zone. But anyway, I digress. But having Coffey there just really made it so much more exciting and legit. And Mario kind of felt like Mario was on an island, like he was a lone wolf, and didn't have a real partner to collaborate with. And Paul Coffey became that guy. And of course, they had played together in the Canada Cup too, so they already had an affinity for one another.
Yeah. What was it? Then, I mean, we get through the late 80s there. Paul Coffey brings us, through that good 88 playoff series. But then your favorite jean jacket wearing Jaromir Jagr comes to town. Thank you, Uwe Krupp, for scoring that goal and ruining our season in 89, 90. But so another guy that you were the first one, right? You picked him up at the airport.
Well, what happened there was, I was working for KDKA, and I'd had a history of having done that with Mario, and I was able to find out when he was coming in to the airport. So Michael Chalik, who's a great videographer for KDKA, legend, he and I went out there and we waited for Jagr to arrive. So there were, I think maybe Tommy Mack was there. I think there were some other media people there, but I was able to then set up an opportunity to go shopping with him because I worked for the team. So that's how that happened. And we went to Ross Park Mall, and that was really a fun experience. His mother was there. His dad was there, and the Nemitzes, the family that he lived with. And we went to, shop for blue jeans. It was really cool. And, but the cool thing about getting Jagr was that you had Badger Bob there now. And so it was Badger Bob was there that day with Barry Smith when Jagr came in. I don't know if you remember the old airport, but there was like an area down below by where the tarmac was. It was kind of a hallway, glass doors, and that's where we were standing. And I'll never forget, Barry Smith looked over at Jagr's ass and he said, "Look at the power train on that guy." and it was true though. and Badger Bob was excited to get him, and it was really great. And Craig Patrick, he was like his baby. And we knew that Yager could be a great player, but we didn't anticipate that he was going to help the Penguins win the Cup that year. I mean, the Penguins had made the playoffs only once in the previous 8 years. We had missed the year before, like you said, because of Uwe Krupp. But I think Craig Patrick really, like you talked about what Paul Coffey did, the day that he brought in Scotty Bowman and Badger Bob Johnson, and then he signed Brian Trottier, and then he acquired Joey Mullen at the draft. I mean, these were a series of events that just made you realize, now we got the guys that can make this thing happen. I give Craig Patrick so much credit for surrounding himself with the smartest guys in hockey. Some guys wouldn't feel comfortable doing that, but he knew who to get, and he just built an incredible off-ice team, and that's why we won the Cup, because we had all the ingredients right from the top down. And we had Jaromir Jagr, who turned out to be one of the greatest players of all time.
Staggy, I know the spring of 91 and 92 had to be one of the greatest times of your life, not just to finally see the Penguins win the Cup 2 years in a row, and not just that they won it, but how entertaining they were. Half of the team literally was Hall of Famers. But even more than that, and those who I talk with, whether it's yourself, Dave Molinari, people who were around those guys, they will say as great as those teams were, as entertaining as they were, the people on that team, the personalities were even better. When you think back to that time, Staggy, whether it be Artie Stevens or Ulf Samuelsson, you just have to smile, don't you, when you think about all the people on that team?
I'll never forget being in the locker room one night after a game, and we'd won the game, and, media was all in there and stuff. And Ulf Samuelsson runs into the locker room naked with a bucket of ice, and he throws it on one of his teammates. I don't know, it might have been Kevin Stevens, because those two were always going after each other. But here comes Alfie naked, like there's girls in there and stuff. It's just such a different world. He didn't care, he was just a wild man. But we had so much fun watching those guys get on each other, like they were always really, really, they could get pretty mad at each other on the bench too. There's those stories of Shel Samuelsson. He was really grumpy all the time, complaining about the forwards not coming back and things like that. And they would yell at each other, and it would get kind of heated sometimes on the bench, but they kept each other accountable, which is really how a team is supposed to work. I mean, that's really, the great teams, they don't need to be really told what to do much by the coaches. It's more about, you got a bench jockey back there who knows what guys to put on the ice when, that kind of thing. But from the motivation standpoint, it's not like, coaches have to go in there and give rah-rah speeches. When you have a great team like that, those guys are the ones who make that happen. They hold each other accountable, and that's what that team was really like. But they were full of personality all the time. It was just really entertaining. I mean, Kevin Stevens, you know what he's like, Josh. He's just one of the most beautiful people that you'll ever meet. Funny, just a real character. And Alfie was kind of a wild man, and Bob Airey was a fun guy. There were just a lot of really good people. And then when we got Rick Tocchet, that was like something special there. I mean, getting him, that was another layer. It's kind of like what Paul Coffey did. Like Tocchet gave us that feeling of toughness. Like, okay, now nobody's going to screw with the Penguins anymore. Right. Like we never had that guy. You know what I mean? Especially with Mario, playing with Mario. I mean, are you kidding me? That line with Mario and Kevin Stevens and Rick Tocchet. Come on, what I mean? That was just, it was unfair.
Staggy, I got to ask you, we're talking about all these personalities, these people we like, Staggy, and we all know them. We've met them. The one guy who's never mentioned, of course, is the goaltender, Tom Barrasso, a very controversial figure. I have to ask, I don't think I've ever asked you, Staggy, did you have any kind of a relationship with Tommy at all? And would you like to see him, when all these teams are honored, wouldn't it be nice for him to come back at some point and kind of make his peace with the city and the organization?
It would, but I just don't think he's going to do it, because I just don't think I think that would that would be counter to everything he's established as his image. Like he kind of likes being that guy that he is. And, I had a working relationship with him in the sense that I felt like I could approach him and ask him questions. And he gave me some interesting stuff about his background. Like, he had a book on goaltending that was written by Jacques Plante, and he really followed that book. It was like his Bible. And he told me about that one time. I think the big thing with Tommy was he felt like he wasn't totally appreciated. When he was in Buffalo, they sent him down to Rochester He had a chip on his shoulder, I think, a little bit. So when he came to Pittsburgh, he still had that, and he just was a different kind of guy. He's adopted. He wasn't, so I don't know that his personal life was, is maybe stable. I don't know what word I would use, but it was just different. He was a just different kind of guy. And he was unbelievably good at his job. Like, he was a great goalie, one of the most skilled goalies in the history of hockey.
Incredibly smart human being too.
Completely smart, and kind of like, a cerebral guy to interview too, that he gave you really intelligent answers. And there were times when he would stand up and it just seemed like he was in a really, really good headspace where he'd talk and you could ask him anything and he wouldn't get offended by it. And then there were other times where he was so sensitive, you felt like anything you asked him, he might snap back at you and say something. So he was kind of tough to approach. So being around him a lot, like I was, traveling and that kind of thing, I think I was probably able to get through that veneer a little bit more than some people. But I thought that I had a better relationship with him because in recent years, I've reached out to him. I have his phone number, and I would text him and ask him if he would do an interview or do this or that. And he would be very respectful in his answer, but he always said no. He would never say yes. And I don't think he ever will say yes. I don't.
One former Penguin who's always welcome back. In fact, the only non-Penguin that I've ever seen get cheered when they scored against us was the first time Ronnie Francis came back. We were in we were in bad shape as a franchise. And I remember he scored and there was a nice applause for him because he's Ronnie. And I always say, anytime someone makes a great play, a smart play, I just think of Ron Francis. The guy never made a mistake on the ice. He makes Berger. I mean, like these guys today, they he's Bergeron to the 15th power.
I agree with you totally. I think, Joe, I used to call him like a human system. Like, he knew how to play defensively as well as offensively in a way that, was kind of like you didn't need to have necessarily a system of defense because he was always going to be in the right place. He had this knack of being able to come back through the neutral zone, and he would kind of take different paths, or routes to be able to cut off guys or, disrupt the flow. The way that coaches coach systems to do that, he would do that by himself. He just had that incredible ability to defend, in transition. And then, of course, when he had the puck, he was very, very creative.
Oh, Stag, he's like a video game. When you hit the button on defense, he's always right next to the perfect guy. And he always made the proper pass. Yes. That's the thing that was so amazing. He just always made the proper pass. I would always say the ex-player made the Ronnie Francis play.
And one thing he was really good at, Joe, he was good at either faking a shot and passing it or faking the pass and shooting it, so he kept you off guard like that. He was really good at deception. In fact, one of his biggest goals in the Stanley Cup final in Chicago in Game 4, he gives you that he's gonna pass it, and he shoots it and scores. It's like he did that a lot, and you're right. He was such a thinking man's hockey player, and I think also, he was great on faceoffs, but I think he was kind of underrated. He was a really good power play guy. He could make great plays along the goal line. He didn't use the half wall. He would play down along the goal line, almost behind the net, places like that. He'd go to different spots to make things happen. Really, really smart. And he was like a coach on the ice.
Was he not? I'm gonna get to the face-off thing in a second, but wasn't he not one of the very first forwards that made it to 4 forwards 1D? It seemed to me like he was one of the first guys that did that. Or
he might have been. I'm not sure. That was more of a college thing. A lot of colleges do that. You might remember Nelson Emerson he was a Bowling Green guy.
Yeah, he was a Hartford Whaler.
He's a Hartford Whaler. He played the point. Like a lot of, Craig Simpson played the point at Michigan State. So I think that was more of a college thing. I don't remember Ronnie being an early guy doing that, but you might be right.
Yeah,
but, I think he could have done it. Let's put it that way.
I'm pretty sure he did it on the Penguins, but I was talking about the face-off. You're talking about a guy so good. That's why there's the red lines on the face-offs, because they always accuse Ronnie of cheating.
He cheated a lot, yeah.
Because the way he would line up, and I just love the fact that he wouldn't really try in the neutral zone. He didn't throw his best stuff.
Yeah.
He only threw his best stuff in the D zone. That's when you know you're awesome at something.
I agree. You know, Brent Peterson was a guy who taught him a lot about faceoffs because he was a player in Hartford with him, and he was really good on draws. It was kind of his specialty. But one of the things Ronnie liked to do was he would tie this guy's stick up and then use his skate to kick the puck where he wanted it to go.
Right.
He was really good at that. And, yeah, I mean, all the little subtleties of the game. Like I said, he was like a coach on the ice. He was always talking to players during the little pauses of breaks in the action. He would always be huddling up with guys, telling them what he wanted them to do. And boy, what an acquisition he was. I mean, that was an unbelievable trade we made there getting him, because he completed the puzzle with Mario as a number one center, him number two. Come on. That was a great combination.
Trotch number three. What do you think about 95? You know, I think we lost to the Rats because of him being injured, but I don't know if we would have beat Colorado. I mean, that's still a tall task.
I remember being in a swimming pool down in Florida right during that series, and Ronnie was in the pool, and he goes, it's a weight-bearing bone. He was talking about his foot. He said it's a weight-bearing bone, and that's when I knew we're done. He's not going to be able to play. And you're right. I hated that series because the league ought to be fined. They ought to fine themselves for what they did, allowing those Rats to be thrown on the ice. Brasso hiding in the net, as they threw those. I mean, come on, this is the National Hockey League. This isn't, the Eastern League or, some league out of, the Central Pro League. It's the NHL, shut it down. You can't be doing that stuff in the playoffs. And then they were cheating like crazy. Like they started the whole hooking and holding thing because they're an expansion team. They got away with murder. They had a bunch of, guys that could do that. I mean, I give them credit. They knew how to do it. But I'll never forget, my brother John was in the stands, and it was game 7, I guess, of that series. And Rhett Warner was a defenseman for the Florida Panthers. And he had Mario in the corner. And Mario tried to get back to the front of the net, and he had him like permanently cross-checked. He was holding him off like this, cross-checking him, and just kind of impeding Mario from getting back out to the front of the net. Okay. And eventually Mario came out and he kind of stumbled and he fell. And my brother John could hear him. He said, "I didn't have the fucking puck." You know what I mean? And that was, believe it or not, that was the beginning of Mario really starting to get upset with the league. When he called it a garage league and that kind of stuff. He'd had enough. He'd had it up to here with the interference. They wouldn't let him play the game the right way. And the Florida Panthers went on and played Colorado. I don't think we beat Colorado without Ronnie Francis, even if we had won that game, mainly because they had Patrick Waugh, who we could never beat. And I just don't think we would have beaten Colorado. They were too good. Yeah. I talked to EJ about it. He thinks we would have won. I don't think so. But we had a hell of a team. We had an unbelievable power play. It was Mario Lemieux, Ron Francis, Peter Nedved, Sergei Zubov, and Jaromir Jagr. That was our power play. And Sergei Zubov was another incredible hockey player that we had. When you think of the guys that have come through Pittsburgh and worn this uniform, and I mentioned other guys before like Joey Mullen and Rick Tocchet, you got Jerome McGinley, you got Thomas Sandstrom, you got Luke Robitaille, you have, it's just ridiculous, the number of stars that we've had. And I can still distinctly remember coming out of the arena one night, Civic Arena, with Mike Lange. He's carrying his briefcase, and we had just played the Minnesota North Stars, who had acquired Bobby Smith in the draft. And Bobby Smith was a really good young player, tall, really, you knew he was going to be a star. And Mike Lange says, "Just give me one player. Just give me one player. Just one. Just give me one player." He was so upset that, we weren't getting these guys and these other teams were getting them. Well, little did he know that we'd get not just one. We'd get Mario, that we'd get Jagr, we'd get Sidney Crosby, and we'd get all those people I just named. I mean, it went from like a desert of, a dry wasteland to one of the richest, most fertile places in the history of any sport. here in Pittsburgh. I don't know if people really realize and appreciate it, but it's really something else. I know you guys do.
Now, Stag, I was on the West Coast. I was in my San Francisco apartment, and it was the highest I ever jumped in my life. When I had to be the only one west of the Mississippi watching the NHL lottery system. It was like at noon our time, or my time. Where were you at when you learned that we got Sydney?
I was in Altoona doing baseball. Chuck Greenberg, who of course associated with the Penguins, Mario's attorney, he owned the Altoona Curve, and he called me one night and asked me if I would want to do the baseball games because the guy they had doing the games was going to be leaving. I had never done baseball. I really wasn't following baseball very closely at that point. I certainly followed it as a kid. I loved Bob Prince and I loved the Pirates when I was growing up. I had a feel for the game, but I didn't really have any much knowledge anymore of the game, like the players and that kind of thing. But anyway, he offered it to me, and I was actually afraid to do it. It was minor league baseball in Altoona, but I still, was afraid. But I decided to do it. So I went there, and I was in the locker room with a bunch of Dominican ball players and Latin guys. And I'm sitting there on a couch, and Sidney Crosby, Penguins get Sidney Crosby, and I jumped up and I'm dancing around the room. These guys were thinking, what is this clown doing? Why is he so excited? They had no concept whatsoever about what I was excited about. But and then there was a cameraman there from one of the small stations up there, the Johnstown station, I think, and he happened to capture it. So somewhere I'm on camera dancing around the locker room in Altoona the day that the Penguins got Sidney Crosby. That was a big deal, man. I didn't realize how big of a deal. And I knew it was exciting and we were getting a great player and all that. But until you actually saw him play, there was sometimes there's hype, you weren't sure if is this guy really as good as they say he is. And, well, yeah, he was.
Staggy.
Go
ahead, Joe.
Oh, no, I was going to say, and, nobody, you put him with Gino. You talk about two guys, absolute carried themselves with class that brought 3 Stanley Cups. I mean, could you ask for anything better for an organization for 20 years?
No, it's amazing that it happened twice. It's amazing that Sid ended up being, living in Mario's house. If you wrote a script, would say, this is too far fetched. We're not going with this. Write something else. I mean, it's just absurd, really, that we were this fortunate. And and I can remember Dave Molinari, like he was really upset that the Penguins didn't get Alexander Ovechkin, but there were some people saying that Malkin might be better than him. And so we didn't feel like we were getting too much of a consolation prize there. We felt like we were getting a different kind of player, but I remember being excited about getting him. And, we saw him the year after Sid's rookie year, and he came in and then he got hurt that first game up in Moncton where he collided with John LeClaire.
LeClaire.
But listen, there were nights when Bob Airy and I would, like, before we go on the air or like during a break or something, we'd be going, I don't know, Malkin might be better than Sid right now. We would argue about which player was actually better. I think that's how great those two players were early in their careers. They were, I think, neck and neck in terms of what they meant to the Penguins, right? And then Sid eventually, I think through his passion and his dedication to all facets of the game and just being Sidney Crosby, he emerged as that special, legendary kind of guy who's in a class by himself. But in terms of sheer ability to impact a hockey game, I mean, there was definitely a debate about which one was better at one point. Well,
Gino has the Lemieux, the witch gene, like the Fedorov has. He has that witch gene where it's just
yeah. He had, it's creativity, right? He had he's not a paint by numbers guy, and he's kind of, he got that when the creative juices are flowing, he goes to another level, right? But he's not a guy who's going to go out and think the game that much. I think it's all natural, kind of instinctive. And whereas Sid is obviously more calculated in the way he plays.
Yeah, Staggy, people don't know this because they're not in the locker room with us, but I think you'll agree with me that for us, old guys like me and Staggy have been around forever. They're on the Penguins now. Listen, Sid's one of the best players of all time, but I think one of my favorite things during the season, and Staggy, you're there with me a lot after practice. Me and Staggy will just waltz on over to number 87's locker, and we'll sit on either side of him, and we'll just talk hockey. And I know you have an affection for the human being that
I love
Crosby and Staggy. There's nothing like it just getting to sit down with him and just talk, isn't it?
I'm telling you, man, I can remember in his first couple of seasons, maybe his first season. One thing that struck me right away is in interviews in the locker room, when you'd ask him, somebody would ask him a question, he would always turn and look at that person in the eye and answer the question. Not a lot of guys do that. Some guys will just sit and kind of look at the floor. The Sid would always look at whoever asked the question with respect. And I remember Phil Bork saying one time, I actually find myself like, what would Sid do in this situation? I want to know what he would do, because like he was like his mentor, and the kid's like 19 years old.
We all think that.
But Josh is right. I mean, it is really true about him being really cordial in the room. And there are times when, he's up and out, you can kind of tell when he's focused on that. But then there's other times when I think he welcomes it, And the PR people tend to want to be protective of him in those situations. But, I think they figured out.
Go ahead. I'm talking to these people. It's okay.
Yeah, right. They've begun to realize that when it's okay to just let him continue to talk to the media, they don't have to protect him. And because like his first couple of years, Frankie Bonomo was that guy that protected him, and he was always like attached to his hip. And I felt like there were times even back then where maybe Sid would have been more inclined to talk to people, but Frankie was the one ushering him out of the room and that kind of thing. But I do think that he actually gains something from these conversations he has with people about hockey. And I think that's part of the fun of being in the game. I mean, it's, for him, he loves the game. He loves the sport. He loves the history of the game. He likes to talk about the strategy. And Josh and I have been very lucky to catch him at times where he's he tells a story. And, if you're a broadcaster or a writer, in particular broadcaster, I would say, because I would go on the air and I'd have a little tidbit, a little nugget or something that I would get from Sid that I could use that nobody else would have, just because I was able to have that conversation with him.
Yeah, he's incredible. What was it like whenever Sid? I mean, you remember us returning to the playoffs in 07, and we kind of all initially, like, me and my friends were like, playoff beards, we're going the whole way, and then the Senators series happened. But then the next year in 08. And that meteoric rise, because, I mean, it just, what was he? He was 20 years old at the time. Every series, I think they went up 3-0, the first three series of the playoffs. It's just, I think it really caught the world by storm. But like, what was it like on the inside of the Penguins organization whenever you're going, oh my God, this is actually happening?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, what I remember is that, or what I reflect on now, is that when Sid got there, the Penguins were already pretty good. We had some good young players coming along, right? We had Fleury, we had Brooks Orpik, we had some key pieces already, just waiting to blossom. So, unlike like what Connor McDavid and what Mario Lemieux went through, Sid didn't have to go through those 5, 6, 7 years of torture before the Penguins got to a level where they could win a cup. In his second year, they made the playoffs. In his third year, they went to the final. In his fourth year, he won the cup. That's really unusual. And I think it's because we'd already had some good players in place, like Letang and Orpik and Fleury. And, Ray Shero did a great job of building that team very quickly. But, yeah, that was a learning lesson against the Senators. We learned the hard way what the difference is between, being good in the regular season and what the playoffs are all about. But they were quick studies. They figured it out. So the following year, and I think they learned something the following year too in the final against the Red Wings, because the Red Wings taught them a lesson on how to play. And I thought through osmosis, they actually became like the Red Wings the year they won the cup. One of the things that I remember about the Red Wings is how fiercely they defended their net. Like all 5 guys would be in the crease, making sure the puck didn't go in. And if you remember, in the following season when we beat the Red Wings, remember Rob Scuderi making the big save, that kind of thing? Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden the Penguins kind of realized that's how we got to play, to be able to get to this promised land. So I think, there was a learning curve there. It was one that the Penguins, the trajectory was pretty amazing. But we were lucky because I remember Bobby Clark saying, well, you guys are going to be doing this for a long time with those two guys, talking about Sid and Gino. Like, he was so jealous. of the Penguins having those two players. It made them sick. Like, they tried to be, the Flyers thought, the Penguins are losing on purpose to get these players. We would never do that,
Oh yeah.
And it was that attitude, Bobby Clarke hated the fact that the Penguins had Sid and Gino. I can tell you that right now. And so it was fun when we beat the Flyers. That's for sure. I know you loved it, Joe.
Oh, I remember 0 for Nixon, Staggy, just like you do. And my buddies went to the Spectrum, Gino and Cuddy, and danced with with the DVE guys. Yeah, oh yeah, I remember all that. That I want to, I kind of think everyone can agree of the holy trinity of 99, 66, and Bobby Orr maybe is the top three, give or take. We know who we say is number one, but we'll let everybody. Do you think Sid can make it to Mount Rushmore? I mean, I only remember Hartford Whale or Gordie Howe, so I can't make a statement on Mr. Howe. I know he's Mr. Howe, but
I think Gordie Howe was really like way better than everybody else. It wasn't just that he was great. It's just that the other players weren't as great as the other ones are now. So there was a bigger gap between him and the other players, right? I think that's one thing that made Gordie Howe kind of stand out, but he was also, I think, probably a greater player than we even realized. Like he could shoot the puck. He was scary, physical, like he was smart, like he was competitive as hell, mean, like all these ingredients, right? Great leader, so he's in that pantheon of players. I think Sid is there too. I do. The way I judge it, guys, is I'm using the Star Trek method. I'm beaming him back. I'm beaming Sid back to a different era, and he's scoring over 200 points. Okay.
Oh yeah.
And just because of the way he plays the game, like, and they say you can't compare eras. Well, that's true, but I can still beam players back. I can tell you, if I beamed Gordie Howe into today's game, I think he'd probably be pretty damn good because he was big. He could really skate, shoot the puck. He was mean. So he had all these ingredients, hockey basics that some other players wouldn't have. If I beamed Wayne Gretzky to today's game, it might be different. Like I remember Mario at the Old Timers game that they had when the Winter Classic was played here. He played in that Old Timers game, and then afterwards he did an interview, and he said they asked him about Gretzky, and he very sneakily said, "Well, he used to curl up a lot, and now with the way they back check in today's game, I don't know if he could do that." You know what I mean? Like he kind of like said, "I don't know, guys. I don't think he would be as great today as he was then." So And I don't know what Mario, like if you beam Mario back or up forward to today's game, I wonder, like just the fact that the way he played the game, he liked to slow the game down, but the big thing is he tortured goalies, and the goalies aren't as easy to torture today. That's why I'm so impressed with Alexander Ovechkin and guys that can put big numbers up. I know Mario's really impressed with Austin Matthews. Like, you can't believe how he scores goals, because he probably looks at those goalies and thinks, I don't know if I could beat these guys the way these guys do. The sticks are different now and all that stuff, but it is almost miraculous the way guys can score today against those big goalies. But if you watch the highlights of Mario and Gretzky, they absolutely tortured goalies, and goalies were very little equipment. I mean, they were just like regular, like forwards really, with a goal stick and pads on their legs, So, and they took the angles away, and it was just a different game altogether. Patrick Waugh changed it forever, I think. But anyway, I think those players. I mean, Connor McDavid to me is the fastest, most incredible, dynamic player I think in the history of the game. There's nobody that can skate as fast as him, and his hands going as fast. But he's going to have to accomplish some things. And I never say, well, he didn't win a cup, but I do think there's some elements to his game that maybe he's going to have to be better at in order to get that final recognition as, top 5 player of all time or whatever.
Staggy, you mentioned Bobby Clarke. It's one of my favorite Dave Molinari stories. This was in Philly about 10 years ago. I walk on the elevator. There's Bobby Clarke, and he's surrounded by 2 like 7-foot tall security guards. Molinari walks on the elevator. He looks at him. He goes, "Huh, just like old times." Bobby didn't like to fight much. Bobby didn't like to fight much, but he was always surrounded by.
No, he was. Oh boy, he was. That's what he was. He was a guy to come in and he'd spear you, and then some goon would take over from there. I mean, but boy, one I'll never forget, guys. The night that Paul Gardner scored 4 goals, first Penguin to do that. He scored 4 goals against the Flyers. Pelle Lindbergh was in goal for Philadelphia at the Civic Arena. and the Penguins were flying, and Paul Gardner was tipping pucks in, and he was having a hell of a game. And in the third period, Bobby Clark had a hat trick, and the Flyers won the game. I think it was 6-5, and it was just heartbreaking. And I remember walking down the hallway by the Flyers locker room, and I looked in the door, and I saw that big Cheshire cat grin, that Bobby Clark grin with no teeth, sitting there, smiling after they won. It was so frustrating. Oh my goodness. You can imagine. I was my second year in the league, maybe my first, and Mike Lange had gone through 15 years of not being able to beat the Flyers, and I can never forget listening to the games on the radio and how the frustration and the bitterness in his voice. Boy, and Gene Hart, the voice of the Flyers, he used to keep the score sheet from the last time the Penguins beat the Flyers. He would hold on to it. And then he would show Mikey, and he would do it all the time to Mikey. I still have the score sheet from the last time you guys beat us, and he would rub it in. You know what I mean? Mike wanted to kill Gene Hart.
One of my favorite things, Stag, every now and then on Pittsburgh Sportsnet or whatever, it's on YouTube too. They'll show the Penguins North Stars Game 6 when the Penguins won the Cup. And people forget Bobby Clark was the general manager.
Yes, he was.
And late in the third period, you guys put him on camera, and you said, Mikey, I know what you want to say. and he actually said, about how we were tortured for years by this guy, and we finally got him. It always made me laugh.
And then Mikey did follow that up with some kind of a comment. I don't remember exactly what he said, but yeah, it's true. I mean, I just said to Mikey, I know what you're thinking right now. And man. Yeah, he really did take it to heart. Like Mikey, it really bothered Mikey that we couldn't beat the Flyers for all that.
He was a true Pittsburgher, even though he was from Sacramento. It bothered everybody. Stack, we have a little bit of time left. We would be remiss, and that's a big word for me to say, without talking now about what's going on now in the state of the Penguins. Not just on ice stuff. I am always optimistic. I'm stupidly optimistic this year because somehow I think Raquel's probably going to go. Hopefully Carlson goes. But I think if we keep Rusty, I think we're a better team than what we put out to start last year. So I don't
disagree. The way I've characterized it, Joe, is I say the Penguins might not have a better record this year than they had last, but I think they'll look better doing it. Like I feel like the optics last year were about as bad as any Penguin team I can remember in recent memory anyway. With turning pucks over and the odd man breaks and allowing goals in the first shot and all that stuff that was just like crazy.
Unprofessional.
Yeah. And I think that, the new coach, the new coaching staff, maybe, infusion of some role players and some youthful players and, maybe a different system, that I think the Penguins probably will be a little bit more structured and maybe be a more, representative team, like in terms of what we would expect to see of a team heading in the right direction. So that's what I'm kind of hoping for. But you never know, because if you do, plug in young players, you get injuries, a lot of things could go sideways on you. So I think that it could be one of those seasons where there's going to be some times where you're kind of shaking your head, but maybe other times where you see some promise. And then when you get to the trade deadline, then you're going to have to make a decision about which direction you want to go for the rest of the season. You're going to have the Olympic break, and then all of a sudden you're going to be sitting there going, we want to finish a little lower in the standings here, guys. I mean, we didn't do that last year. We kept winning, and I didn't mind it too much, but I think with Gavin McKenna out there, not that, it's guaranteed we're going to get him or anything, but I think it will be interesting to see how the team approaches it, the organization does, at the deadline and for the rest of the season if they're not in the playoffs at that point.
Well, Staggy, you mentioned earlier, that you couldn't write this script, that, Mario was, had to sit in his house. And then, 21 years later, we had to sit after Mario. And 21 years later, we could draft Gavin McKenna. So, I mean, isn't that just the Penguins script? Like you talked about how all the great players come through here. And it's like, I'm trying to speak it into existence, but I see on Twitter all day, there are so many Canadian hockey fans of different teams that are commenting going, he's going to end up a Penguin. You just know it's going to happen. I
hope that happens. Oh, so great. Wouldn't it,
It'd be good for all of our.
He's going to be playing up the street in Penn State. We can go watch him there and just get a preview, and then have him put on a Penguin jersey would be unbelievable. That'd be great. And in a way, it would be fitting, I guess, because of the history we've had here. But by the same token, if it doesn't, you don't have to have a generational player to win. Just look at the Florida Panthers. They're a good example of that. So I just like to see us build a nice, good, competitive hockey team, and maybe get fortunate to get a couple of really, really good players along the way in the draft. And it would be nice if the Penguins could, get back to being a contender before Sid's career is over, or before he leaves, whatever happens with Sid. But, I'm going to enjoy the ride anyway, because we've been through so much, and I think you have to keep it all in perspective. We're really lucky to have what we've had. Part of the fun is actually going up that ladder and going through the process. So we're smart enough to know that. A lot of people don't even have that perspective because they never won. They don't know the difference between, building and getting where you want to go, and feeling that feeling of victory after you've been suffering. Those are all the things that have made our time covering the Penguins so enriching. I think that's what makes it a great experience for us on Earth, was to be able to watch these players and to see how the Penguins have done this over the years. And we're all lucky to be a part of it, not just observing it, but actually sort of involved in it,
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, I always say now I can die in peace. In the only scoreboard that really counts, it's 5-2. And that's what Sid and Gino have given me. They've given us 5-2. It'll.
No doubt. And that only is the tip of the iceberg, because what they've accomplished, in terms of wins and losses for the team is one thing, but the thrills that they give you on a nightly basis. I mean, how boring winter would be if we didn't have the Penguins to follow all these years. I mean, we have been blessed. Winters are pretty drab around here. Not with the Penguins. We've had a lot of great thrills.
Well, I think that's what another point I'm making about this season was last year really seemed like we were just dragging through another slog year. Oh, we hope we can do something. We hope, last year was the first year I picked us not to make the playoffs. And this year, I don't think we're gonna make the playoffs. But I love Novak. I love Branicki. Some of the new guys I really want to see play.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited to see how they develop, and I like the idea that the Penguins are collecting assets, draft picks, and things. And there's a method to Kyle Dubas's madness. I think he's kind of doubled and tripled down on the plan, and I like that. He has a plan. I don't feel like he's just throwing shit against the wall to see what sticks. I think he's really got a good idea of how he wants to go about it. So, one thing that we're lucky to have, regardless of who owns the Penguins, is that we do have ownership. Like, I know what it was like when the Penguins had owners that didn't have any money, and we don't have that. We spend to the cap, and we can compete in that respect all day long. That's really important, because it was horrible when we didn't have that. Like, I can remember the Penguins being on the verge of bankruptcy a couple of times when I was there, and that's no fun. That's a real good way to make your life miserable with your wife, your everything. Because if you're working in the business and the business sucks, that's not good. So we've been really lucky, I think, over the last how many years to really have solid ownership with Burkle and now Fenway. I think, they have the resources. That's really important. And it's the most important thing, because you can't win without it. Look at the difference, like with Tampa Bay, when they got their owner in Tampa, and he started, he developed that whole scene around the rink, and he put that big organ in there, and and all of a sudden the Lightning were a legitimate organization. Then look what's happened in Florida. Same thing, right?
Yep.
That's to me is the most important thing. So I'll wait. I'm willing to wait to see how it all unfolds. But as long as you stick to a plan, you got to get a little lucky. You got to get a little bit lucky, and also, I think a lot of it is timing in terms of what the other teams in the league are doing. Because, like, look at Edmonton; they've run into Florida a couple of years in a row now. Like, how would you like to have that happen? So, the idea is to get good when the other teams aren't as good, and see if we can make it.
Yeah. Staggy, you are always good, and this has been unbelievable. We've been talking for a while about having you on, so there's no one I like talking with hockey more than you. You're a wealth of information, generous with your time. Thank you for doing this, Staggy. This is
Oh no, it's really a thrill to be on with you guys. I could do this all night long. I mean, I love talking hockey too, and I don't get a chance to do it much. You know what I mean? So it's in the off season, so it's really great. So thanks a lot for having me.
Wow.
Stag, you're the best. We love you. We can't talk forever. I have talked forever with Staggy about hockey. It's the best. It's the best.
Yeah.
God bless, and we'll see. I'll be watching you on the internet in a couple of weeks when scrimmage A plays scrimmage B and off ice workouts for Team C.
Yeah, well, I'll be at the prospect tournament game in Buffalo like I have the last couple of years, and you never know who you're going to see. I remember going to a couple of years ago, and I saw John Marino go up the ice with the puck, and I texted Bob Airy. I said, I think this John Marino will play in the league this year, and I wasn't wrong. He made the team out of training camp, so you never know who you might see. And I saw Avery Hayes last year. I really liked him, and I think Avery Hayes is going to actually play in the NHL, and I think he's going to be a player that we all like.
Oh, that's good. That's good to hear. Yeah. No, you'll see Joe and I have been streaming your broadcasts at training camp since the internet first started carrying it. but
I remember those of calling training camp games on the internet when I was first starting to do play-by-play. I didn't mind it. It was fun. It was at South Point. I remember Herb Brooks came in, and Kevin Constantine was coaching the team, and he came up and sat in the booth with us. And he said, "We got a bunch of Piggy Flemings out there skating backwards." He basically hated Kevin Constantine, so he didn't want any part of what Kevin Constantine was selling, because Kevin's teams were backing up, and Herbie wanted us on our toes skating.
God bless him.
the great Herb Brooks.
He said whatever was on his mind. I loved him.
That's great.
Well, thank you so much. Like in any time you see Josh tweet or anyone, you're always welcome to jump in.
Crash the party, Stag.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah,
absolutely.
No, thank you so much, Staggy. The great Paul Steigerwald. We will talk to you guys all later, and Paul, enjoy the rest of your summer.
Thanks a lot, Corey. Appreciate it.